So, imagine a city in China. This city in China is a coastal city with a lot of people, a great economy, and it even speaks a European language along with Chinese. It also has special autonomy and wasn't even given back to China until the 1990s. Despite this being a really specific description, it actually applies to two cities. Odds are, probably 4 out of 5 times that description would make you think of Hong Kong. Hong Kong has been in the news lately in regards to its autonomy. It's also a famous location in many movies, and odds are, since Hong Kong speaks English along with Chinese, it makes it more well known to the UK, America, or any other place where English is the main language. But the second city this description applies to is Macau. Obviously, Macau is by no means a forgotten city like my silly clickbait title says, but it is certainly known by far fewer people compared to Hong Kong. So this video is going to talk about the history of Macau, what makes Macau unique, as well as what it's like today. Macau was originally not even a city. It had people, of course, and was owned by China, but for the most part, the area now known as Macau was originally just a place with some people. But along came Portugal with the whole spice trade thing, and they also wanted to trade with China. While they kind of traded, Portugal felt it could do better if it had a sort of base of operations where their ships could rest and drop off whatever goods they wanted to trade to mainland China. China's government at first said no, so Portugal decided to offer money for one. In 1557, the Ming Dynasty agreed to that, and Portugal built a base in the form of a walled village which became known as Macau. This didn't start out like a colony in how you might think of the term, as Portugal did not own the land, rather they rented this land from China at the cost of roughly 44 pounds of silver a year. In addition, while Portugal could govern this new territory, the Chinese law still remained in place for anyone living in it. But regardless, this new trade center grew tremendously over the years. In addition, this became the first continuously flowing source of Christianity into China, as many missionaries would try their luck in China through Macau. At first, Portuguese Macau was considered a part of Portuguese India, especially considering Portugal's biggest trading hub in Asia was Goa in India. But eventually these two areas became separate. Due to the Dutch taking a Portuguese colony of Malacca, suddenly trade between Goa and Macau is more difficult and less lucrative. So Macau declined a bit and found itself less connected with Portuguese India. To make things even worse, in 1685 the Chinese cut off trade with the outside world. Then to make things even worse, in 1841 the British beat China in a war and got their own fancy trading port called Hong Kong right next door to them, and it became more popular. Plus, unlike Macau, which is just being rented, Hong Kong was actually owned by the British. So Portugal took action to reverse the decline. Firstly, in 1842, they declared Macau a free port, forcing Chinese soldiers and officials to leave. China didn't stop them, as they didn't want another war with a European power after such a fresh loss with the UK. But in 1849, they stopped paying the monthly money and flat out said Macau is fully Portuguese now. This time, China was angry and sent a small army to stop them, but got defeated by 36 men and 1 howitzer. So now essentially Portugal was keeping Macau forever. They also acquired a few surrounding islands. China stubbornly didn't even recognize this until 1887 when they signed the Treaty of Beijing. China recognized Portugal's perpetual occupation of Macau. This did improve some things for Macau, but Hong Kong was still bigger. But for a short while, Macau eclipsed Hong Kong thanks to World War II. Once Japan was at war with Britain, they took Hong Kong. Portugal was neutral, so Japan didn't take it from them. As a result, a lot of refugees fled into Macau and it became the only neutral port in China. But in 1943, Japan essentially forced Macau to accept a ton of Japanese advisors to run the place, making it essentially Japanese controlled for the last part of the war. But by 1945, things were back to how they were. In 1949, when the communists declared the People's Republic of China, Macau was regarded as a possession given to Portugal in an unequal treaty. Basically, China was pointing out that the treaty was unfair and forced at gunpoint, so it's essentially stolen Chinese property and Portugal should give it back. The problem was, China, after a long civil war, and of course a huge war with Japan, and they're about to get into another one with Korea, wasn't going to raise a military fuss over a small port like that. But things were still pretty tense, and in 1951 things were made even worse. In 1951, the Portuguese dictator Antonio Salazar turned Macau into an overseas possession. This is a fancy way of saying that Macau isn't a Portuguese colony, but rather Portugal itself. Think of how Alaska is to the United States. It may not be connected directly, but it's still considered core territory. Salazar in fact did this to every Portuguese colony in a time where other European nations were decolonizing. Naturally, this didn't exactly please China, but again, for now, there was very little they could do about it. In the meantime, Macau decided it wasn't just going to be a city of trade and business like Hong Kong, it decided to add gambling and recreation to their resume. They opened up a Grand Prix, allowed gambling to flourish, and they modernized its transportation system for tourists. However, a few times during the Cold War, there were brief clashes between the Chinese and Macanese forces, so things were still pretty tense. But things loosened up as the Carnation Revolution removed the dictatorship in Portugal in 1974, which led the way to opening diplomacy with the People's Republic of China in 1979. With Portugal now democratic, they decided they didn't need those overseas territories anymore. They were kind of expensive anyway, and most people inside them didn't want to be a part of Portugal. Plus, as China grew more on the world stage, it was kind of harder to ignore them. So in 1987, 100 years after the original Treaty of Beijing was signed, a new agreement was made in Beijing that would work on transitioning Macau back to China. However, communist China was different than Macau. Heck, Macau's entire economy was based on gambling capitalism. In addition, some were worried about China's rather authoritarian style of government suddenly imposing itself over the Macanese. Just like with Hong Kong, China answered these concerns with a proposal of theirs. It was essentially a compromise in the form of autonomy for Macau called the One China, Two Systems policy. Basically, Macau could still be capitalist, could still have an autonomous government with its own laws, and could still even force people to use their passports when entering. But it was legally Chinese territory and any foreign affairs would be handled by China. On December 20th, 1999, 2 years after Hong Kong was handed back to China, Macau was handed back to China. This is the very last European colony in Asia, and after 442 years of Portuguese rule, it was all over. Those special autonomous conditions, however, will also end, but not until 2049 unless China decides to keep them going. Considering the recent news of Hong Kong, many are unsurprisingly skeptical about all of it. So what's Macau like today? Well, gambling is still huge, but they're trying to diversify from that. But they're still essentially the Las Vegas of Asia. In fact, its economy is so great that it has the third largest GDP per capita in the world. While its population is not as big as Hong Kong's, it still has over 640,000 people, which is still pretty large. And in fact, considering Macau's size, it actually has the highest population density of any settlement in the world. If you go there today, you can also still see signs of its Portuguese past. It's always interesting, even though that Hong Kong is more well known, Macau still has its own unique history and features that distinguish it. So rather than Macau being the forgotten Hong Kong, Macau is, well, just Macau. Since Hong Kong's autonomy will end before Macau's, maybe Macau's future might become quite interesting, but that's way too far ahead to know for sure. For now, I'm Emperor Tiger Star, and thank you for watching.